Welcome back to Wednesday Night Live. Glad to have you aboard. I hope you had a really great Thanksgiving. We had snow, made it kind of nice, gave it that wintry, almost Christmassy look out there. Hope you stuffed yourself with lots of goodies, had your family together, watched football till you dropped. I hope you had a really great time. Every week at this time, I start off with telling you about Compassionate Hope Pregnancy Center. Compassionate Hope Pregnancy Center is a Christ-centered nonprofit ministry offering life-affirming alternatives to abortion and compassionate care to those who face pregnancy and abortion-related issues. It's really quite simple. 478 HOPE. These are folks who are the antithesis of everything Planned Parenthood. In other words, these folks are all about life. And I hope you will take the time, especially as we're entering into the Christmas season. There may be a young mother out there that really needs some help and compassion and hope. And if you would be so kind as to call area code 208-478-HOPE, you may be exactly the person that God wants to contact this young woman and help her or her family, whatever it is, give them some compassion and hope. At this time of the year when compassion and hope is what the season is really all about. 478 HOPE. God will bless you. You'll feel good about it. And it is tax deductible, so think about that. Anything would be better than nothing. So please, 478 HOPE, Compassion and Hope Pregnancy Center. Well, we've got a lot boy, there's been so much happening over the last couple of weeks. Now, last week we reran the program from the week before, and I did that deliberately because due to some malfunctions and equipment problems, we got thrown off a day, and those who would normally tune in on Wednesday missed it. We did show on Thursday and then again on Sunday, but I wanted to make sure that everybody that would normally tune in on Wednesday night would get to see the show. So we did a double on that. Usually I don't double up unless I'm ill or if there's been some other thing that I just couldn't, it was unforeseeable. We've got two subject areas that I'm going to cover tonight. I hope you'll get a pencil and paper handy and be ready to take down a couple of notes. And well, let me just start off with, now I know that many of you in my audience no longer subscribe to the Idaho State Journal. I understand that, although I will say somebody is doing something to the Journal that's making it look a little bit more like a newspaper. They're putting things in some sort of a logical order. It has a ways to go, but my goodness, it's better than it was just a couple months ago. So, I'm not here to sell their newspapers. I don't care for a lot of the people that write editorials, and theirs are usually a little bit more left than I would like, so I'm not going to sell their newspapers. But I will tell you that since I have to take it in order to talk with you, I do. And it is getting to look a little bit more like a newspaper, like a real newspaper. There's still hope. So with that in mind, let's talk about some things that have been recently in the newspaper. Now, last Sunday, there was an interesting article by Neil Larson. Neil Larson, as you may know, is a radio broadcaster. He's on KIDK, I think it is. And my apologies, Neil, if I got the call letters wrong. 92.1 FM. There we go. And he and Callow Curtis, he comes on quite early, I think about 7 in the morning, and then they run about until 10, I think it is, or maybe 9 in the morning, on every day. And Neil is conservative. He's unabashedly conservative. He's well-read, and he has things to say, and they have a good program. Every once in a while I'll call in, and I listen to it whenever I can. But Neil also writes a regular article just about every week for the Idaho State Journal. Well, I was very interested. I always go to his article. I want to see what he has to say because I usually find something there that I wanted to see him say. I was very interested in this past Sunday's article in the Idaho State Journal because Neil wrote about something that I've been talking to you about for several years now. Now, in the last year, I haven't touched on it much because we've been talking so much about Islam and the radicalization of the Muslim people and all the things that are happening to the world as well as to our country here. And so I've gotten away from an issue that is also something that I feel very strongly about, and that is the homosexualization of our nation. And lo and behold, I have told you on several occasions about a couple of books that I recommend. One of them is called After the Ball. And After the Ball is After the Ball, How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s. So it's a little bit outdated. The information is not outdated. The premises are not outdated. Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen. And that is After the Ball. Now, there's another one that is very important for you, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So if it seems like we're going over plowed ground, we are. And I'm doing this namely because, first of all, I want to thank Neil for having put this in the paper. Neil has a lot of credibility, and he is very erudite. He writes very well. And I'm going to share the article with those of you who don't take the newspaper, simply because I think it's important enough that we should all take a look at it. And its title, it was Sunday, November 29th in the Idaho State Journal, How One Obscure Book Dramatically Altered Our Cultural Landscape, by Neil Larson. In 1987, two authors co-wrote an essay entitled The Overhauling of Straight America. The essay, printed in Guide magazine, laid out a few points directing how homosexuals could advance their agenda on a mass scale. Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madson's most visible argument was to simply present homosexuality as, quote, just another thing, with a shrug of their shoulders. The ideas in the essay were developed into a book published 2 years later called After the Ball: How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s. The book laid out a decade-long timeline using what is often described as Madison Avenue marketing, combined with techniques canonized as progressive dogma 2 decades prior in Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. And that's a book you should get. You need to, if you read Rules for Radicals, you will gain a new understanding of what's happening to our nation and why Obama has had such a profoundly negative effect on our nation. Not just Obama, but all of his sycophants and tag-alongs have had a profoundly negative effect on our nation. And you can go there and learn everything you want to know about the Clintonians, Hillary, how they operate. Rules for Radicals. But I digress. Let's move on. After the Ball openly proposed a 3-part strategy: desensitization, jamming, and conversion. Desensitization was in part described this way, quote, if gays can live alongside straights, visibly but as inoffensively as possible, they will arouse a low-grade alert only which, though annoying to straights, will eventually diminish for purely physiological reasons. Straights will be desensitized. We can extract the following principle for our campaign to desensitize straights to gays and gayness. Inundate them in a continuous flood of gay-related advertising, presented in the least offensive fashion possible. If straights can't shut off the shower, they may at least eventually get used to being wet. Do you wonder why for years, and still, nearly every television show and movie almost robotically contained a plot line with favorable casting of a gay character? This was no accident. The second phase, jamming, was described by Kirk and Madsen as enjoyable and heartening. It focused on overwhelming the public with a level of shame they couldn't adequately respond to. Quote, the trick is to get the bigot into the position of feeling a conflicting twinge of shame, along with his reward, whenever his homo-hatred surfaces, so that his reward will be diluted or spoiled. This can be accomplished in a variety of ways, all making use of repeated exposure to pictorial images or verbal statements that are incompatible with his self-image as a well-liked person, one who fits in with the rest of the crowd. Thus, propagandistic advertisement can depict homophobic and homo-hating bigots as crude loudmouths who are not quote-unquote Christian. It can, in short, link homo-hating bigotry with all sorts of attributes the bigot would be ashamed to possess, and with social consequences he would find unpleasant and scary. This description sounds all too familiar. Incidentally, this tactic has been unknowingly internalized by large masses of social media users and internet lurkers in just about every cultural discussion beyond cultural homosexual issues. The subtle inference that anyone who holds any hesitation at all over normalizing any particular facet of all things LGBT is automatically unlikable, worthy of shame and shunning. The third phase, conversion, could be considered agenda completion. The two authors wrote, it isn't enough that anti-gay bigots should become confused about us or even indifferent to us. We are safest in the long run if we can actually make them like us. Conversion aims at just this. By conversion, we actually mean something far more profoundly threatening to the American way of life, without which no truly sweeping social change can occur. We mean conversion of the average American's emotions, mind, and will through a planned psychological attack in the form of propaganda fed to the nation via the media. We mean subverting the mechanism of prejudice to our own ends, using the very processes that made America hate us to turn their hatred into warm regard, whether they like it or not. A planned psychological attack through the media, whether they like it or not. Is there any doubt now about an orchestrated agenda that has steadily over the years, through a drumbeat of messaging and shame tactics, altered our perceptions? Shortly after Kirk and Madsen penned their essay, they were featured in numerous national publications. Though not household terms, their essay and subsequent book turned into the coalescing clarion called for the homosexual agenda. It is only by chance that after the ball was written and the subsequent agenda seemed so closely to follow its prescription that Kirk and Madsen are the luckiest authors in the world. I tend to believe progressives saw the plan, liked it, and went with it. Perhaps most disturbing for me is the virility of such propagandistic techniques. It seems to be most common for human beings to make a beeline to identify as a non-bigot by adopting for themselves warm and fuzzy labels so vague they essentially become worthless. Equality, diversity, inclusion. Not for a moment would I argue that we should return to the days when life was incredibly hard for gays, or that basic civil rights were being violated, or that it is in any way acceptable to treat someone else poorly for conditions seemingly beyond their control. Yet, that is not the same as believing children do better with a mom and dad, or that traditional marriage has been a solid societal foundation we should continue to enshrine. When I married my wife, we, together, very much looked forward to bringing children into this world. To suggest that the opportunity and ability to biologically healthy people to naturally create life together adds nothing special to a relationship is patently absurd. Yet that is the assertion of the gay rights agenda, and the illogical conclusion we are not supposed to scrutinize, believing that a relationship that cannot naturally bring forth life is somehow equal to one that can. You've been conditioned to cringe at such suggestions. Well, suspend your Pavlovian commendations and automated indignance for a moment, and instead consider that it may be a rational basis for why gay marriage isn't equal marriage. Furthermore, and finally, consider the possibility that the origins of your perceptions today of homosexuality and its place in society has been dramatically altered thanks to one little essay and book written over a quarter century ago. I can't begin to tell you my surprise when I picked up the paper and I read that article. There's been so much in the news recently about the invasion of Europe by Islam and the proposed dumping of Syrians right in our own backyard as well as throughout the nation, that I was quite surprised that Neil would be talking about this issue. But I'm so glad he did, because this is not going away. This issue is not going to change. Remember, as we've talked about this over the last several years, especially when we were trying to overturn the so-called non-discrimination ordinance, we took a lot of flack for our position, and we took a lot of hatred, a lot of threats, death threats included. It was not a pretty scene for my wife and I, and for other people who felt, basically, as this article points out, that less than 3% of the populace that is shoving this down our necks, well, I don't have to dwell on that too much as far as this goes, but I want to remind you now, I've told you several times, and again, this is why I always ask you to have a pencil and paper handy. These are some books you really need to get. You need to, if you haven't already, and I know some of you in the audience have approached me and told me, hey, I'm glad you suggested such and such. I got it. I really appreciate the information. This is one you need to get, The Homosexualization of America by Dennis Altman. It's not mentioned in this article, but it is a book that you need to familiarize with, if for no other reason but to protect your family and especially your children. The homosexual agenda is all about recruiting your children, and I say recruiting in the very positive sense, to recruit them. Now, this is a book that I've mentioned to you before. This will give you a very good idea of the anger and the mobilization, the militarization of the homosexual community. This is called When the Wicked Sees a City. This is a good, you can get these on the secondary market relatively inexpensively. This is by Chuck and Donna McElhenney and Frank York, When the Wicked Sees a City. This was written by a pastor and his wife who he had been transferred to, I think it's a Presbyterian, it's been a while since I read this. It was a Presbyterian church, I believe, in San Francisco. And what this family had to endure, because this man had the temerity in San Francisco to preach the true gospel and to talk about God's true purpose for a man and a woman, and God's dislike for homosexuality, these people suffered greatly. But you need to, this is a good way for you to see the militant homosexual, not the ones that are shown on television as nice or silly or weak or erudite or intellectually strong or anything. The real homosexual agenda, it's right there, When the Wicked Sees a City. And finally, returning to the book that was mentioned by Neil Larson in his column this last Sunday, After the Ball, How America Will Conquer Its Fear of and Hatred of Gays in the 1990s, or in the 90s. This is a must-read for everybody who is concerned for the health of your family, of your children. You know, those of you who are adults, and most of my audience, if not all of it, are adults who have already made their determination in life. But if you have children still at home, or if you have grandchildren who you have some influence, or you're going to need to know this to protect them. Isn't it interesting? One of the things we've been talking about for some time also, here's an interesting little picture. You're not going to be able to see it really clearly, but there's a precious little baby, and next to it is a cake, a celebratory cake, in the so-called gay pride colors. It used to be the rainbow, and I'd like to see us reclaim the rainbow for God, since he's the one that put it up for a covenant with mankind. But the caption on this reads, "We live in a society where if you refuse to bake a same-sex marriage cake, the government will destroy you. But if you sell dead baby parts from Planned Parenthood, the government will fund you." Irony of ironies. Well, there was an article, I shared this with you, it might be more than a year ago. I'm going to share it again. Some of you may be new to this broadcast. I'm going to share it again because it again goes to the very essence of the militarization, the outright anger of the homosexual community, as very aptly described, and how this guy did this, except that it came right from his cold stone heart. But it was an article by a fellow named Michael Swift, and this is back in 1987. It was an editorial in February of 1987. Now, all I could find about Michael Swift says that in 1987, Michael Swift was asked to contribute an editorial essay to the Gay Community News magazine. Now, the Gay Community News magazine no longer exists, or it has a new title. This editorial essay was later reprinted in the Congressional Record, pages 21-195 through 21-195, and in the National Federation for Decency Journal in October 1987. And this is noteworthy for its own sake, and you'll see why. I have told you many times, and I knew this from my years in working in the homosexual community undercover. I had learned up close and personal just how angry and militant and physically dangerous homosexuals who are really dedicated to their lifestyle, to their totem, whatever you want to call it, that they can really be. Mr. and Mrs. America don't really know. And here again it goes, Neil Larson made a good point. For some years now, gradually but steadily and increasingly, homosexualized people, homosexuals, have been introduced into the mainstream purposely to dilute it, so that at some point you and your children, who are fully inundated, they get it at school, they get it in their social programs, they're always just bathed in this filth. But it's been gradual but increasing. And it has gotten to the point where I can talk to my grandchildren, and sometimes I'm a little surprised at what they are finding acceptable. And they're Christians. They are Orthodox Christian kids, but they have been brainwashed. And, you know, parents don't get the same gravitas as the professors at school. And even if you've been a really conscientious parent raising your child, you really have your hands full trying to offset the garbage that they're being fed through the media and at school. My wife and I were watching, we have Netflix, we enjoy that. We don't go out, we're not party animals, we stay at home and watch television. And we have Netflix, and recently we decided to start watching Gotham. And it's, if you don't know about Gotham, it's entertaining, and it's a takeoff from the DC comics of yesteryear. Gotham could be any major metropolitan city. They show shots periodically between scenes. It could be New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, any place. But there was, in the very first program, the first episode, there was a suggestion of a homosexual relationship between two women, one a police officer and one the girlfriend of a police officer. And I thought, oh, please don't do this. We don't need that. What does that have to do with the story? And my wife and I said, all right, maybe they got it out of their system. No, they didn't. On the second episode, they had I guess you'd call it a soft porn shot of the two lesbians embracing in bed and kissing. Now, was that necessary? No, it wasn't. But the sad thing is, this is the kind of program that is shown in main time television when your kids are watching it, and they're exposed to this garbage. 30 or 40 years ago, that was called porn. Today, it's just part of the storyline to make you more accepting of the homosexual lifestyle. Even Blue Bloods, which is a program my wife and I enjoy, they've had their homosexual incident where they had to wrestle with a homosexual partner of another police officer, and whether or not he was going to accept his partner after he found out that he had come out of the closet. But it continues. It's continually bathing you in this until you're just up to your eyeballs and drowning. All right. Well, let me get back to what I was saying here. Now, this was the article I told you that this guy wrote it as an editorial for the Gay Community News magazine, which, as I said, doesn't exist anymore, back in February of 1987. This essay is Entre Madness, a tragic, cruel fantasy, an eruption of inner rage, or on how the oppressed desperately dream of being the oppressor. I quote the article. We shall sodomize your sons, emblems of your feeble masculinity, of your shallow dreams and vulgar lies. We shall seduce them in your schools, in your dormitories, in your gymnasiums, in your locker rooms, in your sports arenas, in your seminaries, in your youth groups, in your movie theater bathrooms, in your army bunkhouses, in your truck stops, in your all-male clubs, in your houses of Congress, wherever men are with men together. Your sons shall become our minions and do our bidding. They will be recast in our image. They will come to crave and adore us. Women, you cry for freedom. You say you are no longer satisfied with men. They make you unhappy. We, connoisseurs of the masculine face, the masculine physique, shall take your men from you. Then, we will amuse them. We will instruct them. We will embrace them when they weep. Women, you say you wish to live with each other instead of with men. Then go and be with each other. We shall give your men pleasures they have never known, because we are foremost men too. And only one man knows how to truly please another man. Only one man can understand the depth and feeling, the mind and body of another man. All laws banning homosexual activity will be revoked. Instead, legislation shall be passed which engenders love between men. All homosexuals must stand together as brothers. We must be united artistically, philosophically, socially, politically, and financially. We will triumph only when we present a common face to the vicious heterosexual enemy. If you dare to cry faggot, fairy, queer at us, we will stab you in your cowardly hearts and defile your dead puny bodies. We shall write poems of the love between men. We shall stage plays in which men openly caress men. We shall make films about the love between heroic men, which will replace the cheap, superficial, sentimental, insipid, juvenile, heterosexual infatuations presently dominating your cinema screens. We shall sculpt statues of beautiful young men, of bold athletes, which will be placed in your parks, your squares, your plazas. The museums of the world will be filled only with paintings of graceful, naked lads. Our writers and artists will make love between men fashionable and de rigueur, and we will succeed because we are adept at setting styles. We will eliminate heterosexual liaisons through usage of the devices of wit and ridicule, devices which we are skilled in employing. We will unmask the powerful homosexuals who masquerade as heterosexuals. You will be shocked and frightened when you find that your presidents and their sons, your industrialists, your senators, your mayors, your generals, your athletes, your film stars, your television personalities, your civic leaders, your priests are not the safe, familiar bourgeois heterosexual figures you assumed them to be. We are everywhere. We have infiltrated your ranks. Be careful when you speak of homosexuals, because we are always among you. We may be sitting across the desk from you. We may be sleeping in the same bed with you. There will be no compromises. We are not middle-class weaklings. Highly intelligent, we are the natural aristocrats of the human race, and steely-minded aristocrats never settle for less. Those who oppose us will be exiled. We shall raise vast private armies, as Mishma did, to defeat you. We shall conquer the world because warriors inspired by and banded together by homosexual love and honor are invincible, as were the ancient Greek soldiers. The family unit's spawning ground of lies, betrayals, mediocrity, hypocrisy, and violence will be abolished. The family unit, which only dampens imagination and curbs free will, must be eliminated. Perfect boys will be conceived and grown in the genetic laboratory. They will be bonded together in communal setting under the control and instruction of homosexual savants. All churches who condemn us will be closed. Our only gods are handsome young men. We adhere to a cult of beauty, moral, and aesthetic. All that is ugly and vulgar and banal will be annihilated. Since we are alienated from middle-class heterosexual conventions, we are free to live our lives according to the dictates of the pure imagination. For us, too, much is not enough. The exquisite society to emerge will be governed by an elite comprised of gay poets. One of the major requirements for a position of power in the new society of homoeroticism will be indulgence in the Greek passion. Any man contaminated with heterosexual lust will be automatically barred from a position of influence. All males who insist on remaining stupidly heterosexual will be tried in homosexual courts of justice and will become invisible men. We shall rewrite history, history filled and debased with your heterosexual lies and distortions. We shall portray the homosexuality of the great leaders and thinkers who have shaped the world. We will demonstrate that homosexuality and intelligence and imagination are inextricably linked, and that homosexuality is a requirement for true nobility, true beauty in a man. We shall be victorious because we are fueled with the ferocious bitterness of the oppressed, who have been forced to play seemingly bit parts in your dumb heterosexual shows throughout the ages. We too are capable of firing guns and manning the barricades of the ultimate revolution. Tremble, hetero swine, when we appear before you without our masks. That, my friend, is the true heart of the homosexual revealed. Now, you're not going to get the locals who so bitterly opposed my wife and I and the 80 or so people who worked so diligently to overcome the anti-discrimination ordinance, which, by the way, the so-called non-discrimination ordinance, the anti-discrimination ordinance, which invented a new class of people, basically, homosexual people, passed by only 56 validated votes, 56. It cost them $156,000. And let me just see if I can find this list here of some of the people that were involved in that. This was not their fight against our referendum was not just a grassroots local entity. Let's see, the American Civil Liberties of New York, Human Rights Campaign of Washington, D.C., a huge, huge organization, multi-million dollars. Planned Parenthood Votes Northwest of Seattle, Washington, Nicole Lefevre, former state senator. Pride Foundation, Seattle, Washington. Hilltop Public Solutions, Washington, D.C. Greenlight Media Strategies, Brooklyn, New York. Los Angeles LGBT Center, Los Angeles, California. National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Action Fund, Washington, D.C. And numerous boiler rooms across the nation, most notably at UCLA, Los Angeles. These were the people who forced this community and many others to accept this travesty, this terrible law that made the rest of us basically into second-class citizens. And you see how the homosexual mind actually works. This is probably the most articulate I've ever seen it done, but that is part and parcel of the homosexual mind. Now, I can hear it right now. If somebody there in your room, if you are homosexual or somebody in your room is watching this, I can see right now they're saying, Lillig, you're a bigot. You know, bigot is defined as someone who dislikes without reason. Well, there's certainly much reason to dislike the homosexual agenda. And so I would say I'm not a bigot in any stretch of the imagination, but if you are part of that cabal, I'm sure you would call me a bigot as one of the nicer things. But remember this. This is something you commit this to memory. The greatest single victory of the gay movement over the past decade has been to shift the debate from behavior to identity, thus forcing opponents into a position where they can be seen as attacking the civil rights of homosexual citizens. And this is from The Homosexualization of America, the book I told you about, by homosexual activist Dennis Altman. It isn't going to stop. Now, you remember we're going on 3 years since that I don't even know how to describe it, hit the fan. And we had tons of people right here in the City Hall, people who by and large, were not from this community. They were from other states, other communities, but most of them were not from this community. There were a few in this community leading the band, certainly ginning up the angst. But you remember that night after night they sat in front of or stood before the city council, giving these sob stories about how they were marginalized and how they were just people like everybody else and all that. Well, there's the true heart of the homosexual mind. The so-called anti-discrimination ordinance, non-discrimination ordinance, that really only has teeth in one regard. You and I both know as reasonable people that a homosexual person, unless they choose by their lifestyle, by their dress, by the way they do things, unless they choose to bring themselves out in the open, can conceal themselves very easily and fit in with the 97% of the society who are not homosexual. That law really is intended, for the most part, I would say 99% of it, to protect the so-called transgenders, who are homosexuals, males portraying females, females portraying males. Those are very obvious, and many people find themselves very put off by having a 6 foot, 230-pound linebacker show up in a skirt with makeup and trying to look feminine. Doesn't work. Or you see the 5'5" female who's all butched out and pierced and tattooed or whatever. And I'm deliberately stereotyping to get your mind looking on. Those are the people that law is meant to protect. And what does it do? But it's bad law. Bad law should always be contested, and it puts the rest of us as second-class citizens. I wrote a letter, actually it was an email, to when this was being fought out in Boise, when they were having the hearings up there. And if you watch those, and I watched almost all of it, and time after time you saw these people coming up with these just outright lies or fabrications about how they were being marginalized and how the whole world was against them because they were homosexual. Most of those coming up to the microphone, male or female, until they identified themselves as homosexual, you wouldn't know. The females looked female, the males looked male, until there were a few that came up in drag. It was very obvious what they were or what they were not, and those are the ones who these laws are really made to protect. But I wrote an email because there was I was requested actually to write something to the various representatives up there, because we had been fighting this fight down here, and the word had gotten up there that we had a big fight going on down here. And so I wrote to a number of the representatives, and here's what we said. My name is Ralph Lillig, and my wife and I live in Pocatello, Idaho. Last year, we concluded a 2-year struggle to defeat a so-called non-discrimination ordinance that was passed by one vote by City Councilman Steve Brown, a name that you should remember, field representative for Representative Mike Simpson. That historic vote was the culmination of 2 years' work by the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, LGBTQ lobby to have said ordinance added to Pocatello's municipal code. Subsequent to the ordinance being passed, my wife and I, with help from local volunteers, circulated a petition for referendum to place the question before the voters in the next general election. Despite almost impossible odds, we succeeded in garnering sufficient signatures to have the issue placed on the May 2014 ballot, even after the county elections office threw out some 500 signatures. Little did we suspect that we would stir such a hornet's nest of opposition from the LGBTQ and their associates. During the campaign to have the ordinance repealed, our grassroots organization, Vote Yes Pocatello, raised approximately $15,000. By contrast, the LGBTQ organization, Fair Pocatello, raised approximately $156,000 to defeat our efforts and keep the ordinance in place. But enormous amounts of money is just scratching the surface. Allow me to list the organizations arrayed against our local mom and pop effort, and I just gave you the names of those. Ultimately, we lost to the LGBTQ lobby by 56 certified votes. This is only a partial list of those enlisted by the LGBTQ community, but it makes it obvious that regardless of how the left wish to portray it, the LGBTQ effort is not a local effort. It is carefully orchestrated, well-funded, professionally organized assault upon ours and your community. And it is readily apparent ours was very much a David Pocatello Goliath national LBGT contest. So that was the communication we sent regarding that. That's history now. Now, why has this come up again? Well, I'm not really sure what prompted Neil to write that article. I'm glad he did, because eventually we were going to have to address it, because you may recall I have told you time and again that these various organizations, like all under one roof, I would characterize them, regardless of how they portray themselves. It is an organization run by and for homosexuals whose supposed purpose in life is to give a safe haven for youth who identify as homosexual. In my opinion, and that's all this is in my opinion, based on my experiences working undercover and dealing with various organizations who do this, I would say it is more likely a recruiting ground, a grooming place, where the homosexuals who run this under the guise of being there to protect or to help the homosexual kids can really just reinforce the lifestyle, make sure these kids are fully indoctrinated and thoroughly seeped in it so that they won't change their mind. That's my opinion. All right. So let's see. We're gonna have a little time for our next issue. I'm going to just hit a couple things. I want to get on to. No, doggone it. As much as I want to, we're going to have to move on to the next subject. There is so much. Remember, recently, this has been in the news. The two school teachers, both females, who have both been caught preying upon their female students in lesbian relationships. And one of them, sadly, very sadly, in one of them, apparently a mother was duplicitous and complicit in helping her, I think it was a 14-year-old daughter, by allowing her to stay overnight with her female coach, who was a lesbian, grooming this child, and they had a quote unquote romance. I think it came out when the child was then 16, and the child and the parents did not want to testify because they didn't want that child's name dragged through the mill. These were two females, both lesbians, whom are to be protected, who are preying upon the very children that they are tasked to protect. And these are not isolated incidents. You know that. Whether it's the coach in the university back east that had been preying upon young men for years, or priests in the church that had been preying on young men for years. These are homosexual assignations. These are assassinations of the spirit of these children done by degenerates who are preying upon children. Now, I am not calling them degenerate simply because they're homosexual. I feel the same way about heterosexuals preying upon children. But in this case, these degenerates are sodomites, and they are preying upon children. And if you don't like the word sodomite, go to the Bible, and if it's good enough for God, it's good enough for me. All right. We've got to move forward a little bit because we've got just a little bit of time, but we definitely have got to get in something about what's going on right here in this country. The Sheikh Obama and his harem and whatever those things are that he has following him around has been meeting in Paris and on climate change. He's not worried about the world going up in flames under Islam. No. That's not a threat for Sheikh Obama for obvious reasons. He is part of the problem. No, world climate change is his problem. And so he's fretted away millions of dollars to get him over there to talk to his fellow travelers, whatever they are, about world climate change, which, it's very interesting. I heard this on the radio today, and it's well worth repeating. We've only been keeping track of climates for a little over 100 years. I mean, really in a scientific way, and even that has gone from rudimentary or very basic to scientific, and even today's scientific is so skewed and is so much compromised that nobody knows the truth. But these people, I think it first came to light under Al Gore. Remember Al Gore, inventor of the internet, and who also made a fortune in selling carbon offsets or whatever? I think it was he who first started beating the drum for climate change. And it's very interesting, if you remember, I remember it quite well. I think it was back in the 70s when climate change, the fear was that the world was going into a new ice age, and we had to prepare for that. And they gave all kinds of reasons why the sun was going to be blotted out, and we were in fear of a new ice age. Now it's going to be a new hot, unbreathable, who knows what it is today, other than the fact that it is a lie. Well, so that's where Obama's worried about. But we here at home have some other things that we have to be a little bit more concerned about, not the least of which is the Islamization of the free world. We've seen what's going on in Europe, and that is no less than an invasion of Europe. And finally, thank heaven, finally, people with gravitas, with stature, are finally starting to speak out and say, look, Dr. Carson was in the Middle East recently talking with refugees, and he came back with a report, and I certainly can't cover the whole thing in a few words, but basically he said in his talks with the people there, they're not eager to go someplace else. They want to stay in their own home, but they can't. They need to be protected. And isn't it ironic? They need to be protected from their own religion of peace adherents, the other people who are living under the Qur'an. Now, we can't give that to the Christians. The Christians, the Yazidis, the Druze, they're all victims of the religion of peace. But isn't it interesting that the religion of peace is killing everybody that won't adhere to this very narrow, basic, and completely, what's the word everybody likes to use today? Organic understanding of Islam. These guys, the ISIS nutcases, are practicing pure Islam. Now, there's been talk about from some very reputable people, people who I think highly of, who remain Muslim, and that baffles me. I can't imagine how they can remain Muslim when if they read their own religion, and they see what a horror story it is, and yet they talk about reforming Islam. Islam cannot be reformed, because if it is reformed, it's no longer Islam. Islam has protected itself. The Qur'an has protected those who practice Islam. It has isolated anybody who steps away and tries to reform it. The Qur'an says you can't reform it. You can't change a single word. And if you do, you're an apostate and you must die. So how can it be reformed? It cannot be reformed. The only solution for those who truly look for true peace is to step out of Islam and find someplace else to go. I'm not going to tell them where to go, but I'm going to say that they cannot reform Islam. So now we're going to bring 10,000, and those numbers keep changing, 10,000 Syrians, of whom a handful are Christians, who basically pose no threat to this nation. And it's very interesting that Syria and Iraq, and that area, they used to have well over 3 million Christians. They are under a million now. In fact, it's close to something like 330,000. 3 million to 330,000 existing Christians. The rest have been slaughtered by the religion of peace, the jihadists, the Islamists, the purveyors of the poison that is Islam. Remember now, Islam is not a religion. You've got to get that out of your head, that you think, well, it's no different than being a Presbyterian or a Jew. Yes, it is, because neither of those are political. Islam is both religious, Quran, and political, Sharia. They go hand in glove under the mantle, if you will, of Islam. Islam is just a word meaning submit. Submit to the Quran, submit to the Hadith. Submit to Sharia. But it is a political, it is a theocracy, if you will. and it is therefore antithetical to, or antithetical, however you want to say it, to everything American. It does not, it cannot survive under our Constitution. Islam, by its own definition, by its own parameters, must conquer, and meaning our Constitution has to go away. And the more of these folks we bring in, the closer we are to being conquered. Let me share something. Let's see if I can find this. Let me give you, here's something of interest. You know, we're going to get some 300 Syrians in Twin Falls, that area, and they're being brought in. Isn't it interesting? They're being brought in by the College of Southeast Idaho, sorry, CSI. Why is it always like our university here? We have some, depending on who you talk to, 1,200 to 2,000 Muslims here, most of them Sunni from Saudi Arabia. They're paid for by Saudi Arabian government and Kuwait. This is a potential time bomb of horrendous proportions. If we have 2,000 here, if only 1% decide to radicalize or are just waiting to activate, that's still 20, and they could wreak havoc in this community. Again, think of what happened in Paris with only 8. Imagine in this small community if we had 1% of those 2,000 at the university that were radicalized and ready to go. It would be horrendous. I'm sure that we would prevail, but there would be an awful lot of people hurt and killed in prevailing. And they want to die. These purists, they want to die for Allah. What kind of a religion is it that requires you to die to go to your paradise? Now, if you're an Orthodox Christian, if you're a Mormon, or if you're a Jew, what part of your paradise requires you to die to go to it? I don't know of one. Only Islam. I tell you this as a personal opinion. I have seen nothing that can dissuade me from this. I am convinced that Islam, because of the way it's constructed, the fact that it came from this madman who portrayed himself as the prophet of Allah, and do not confuse Allah with God, the God you and I, it is a God, it is theirs, but it is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Although they do say that they are Abraham, but they don't declare themselves Isaac and Jacob. They don't want that part because that brings to the Messiah. They can't do that. So theirs is a false. Everything in Islam is contrary to Christian doctrine. It's the exact opposite. In other words, it's satanic. It's just exactly as you learned. If you're an Orthodox Christian and if you're Mormon, you learned as a kid, as a child, those things that are of God. And we learned about why Satan was cast from heaven. We learned these things at our mother's knee, hopefully, or someplace along the line. And we learned at some point you had to come to the conclusion that Satan is always 180 from God's plan. Homosexuality is part of that. It's 180 opposed to God's plan. God's plan is for a man and woman to come together, to cleave to each other as one and produce this new life that is part of both of them. A man and a man can't do that. A woman and a woman can't do that. Those are the things of Satan. The Islamicists, their everything has to do with death or some other punishment of those who will not adhere to the pure foundations of it. There is no peace in Islam except to those who submit, and even then it isn't peaceful. And there are people falling away from Islam all the time, but they're completely under threat. Their threat is just as bad as it is to be a Christian. To be an apostate Muslim in some ways is even worse. I remember a doctor that my wife had many years ago who was Urdu from Pakistan, and he was a Muslim, but he was non-practicing. He was secular for all intents and purposes, but he made a comment to me once that really got my attention. He told me that if he and my wife and I, who are Christians, were sitting in the same room and the Muslim jihadists found that he was of this particular tribe and we're Christians, they would kill him first before they would kill us because he's considered apostate. There is no way out of that except through extraordinary courage, and then you have to run for your life. Well, anyway, I got a little carried away on that, but I'm very passionate about this. I truly believe that Islam is of Satan. I believe that Muhammad was Satan's spokesman. That's who I believe Allah to be. Pardon me, and I realize by saying that on public television, I'm basically signing my own death warrant with the purist jihadists here at the university or anywhere else. I realize that. but I will not be intimidated by Satan and his emissaries. But here's what a little tidbit of information about what's going to happen out at the College of Southeast Idaho, or Southern Idaho. Federal tax funds. Now, 300 refugees are planned for fiscal 2016. South Central Health District medical screening, federal tax funds, $110,000. State of Idaho tax funds, $19,000. Health screening provided for newly arriving refugees. Twin Falls School District costs. Based on 235 refugee students speaking over 19 languages, federal tax funds, $1,880,000, $8,000 per refugee student. Local tax funds, $249,356, that's ESL staff. Welfare and medical, and this part, if it doesn't gall you, then you're not listening. Welfare and medical programs. These refugees coming in are immediately eligible for food stamps, WIC, Section 8 housing, Medicaid, and Medicare. Remember, if you are a working American, you're not eligible for Medicare until you reach, currently it's age 65. And you've been paying into it all those years. These people are coming over here as refugees, paying not one nickel into it, and are automatically on Medicare and Medicaid. Every refugee is enrolled in some form of welfare and medical programs for a time. A small amount of refugees are enrolled for life into the Social Security SSI Medicare program. We currently do not have the cost for this, but for the first 6 months, for 300 refugees, it is estimated at over $1 million. Then there's local court and law enforcement costs. Unknown at this time, total 6-month cost to resettle 300 refugees at CSI, $4,588,356. That's our tax money. Now, let me just share this with you, and you can see why this is particularly galling to me, and I hope it is to all of you, those of you who have been paying into Social Security all these years, and you had no choice. This is taken from you, except if you were in some law enforcement or firefighters or something like that. When I was with the city of Los Angeles, I did not pay into Social Security. However, I worked so many other occupations that I did pay Social Security, including my 15 years in the military. So I had Social Security that was waiting for me. When I went to get my Social Security, I was wept. That stands for welfare, I forget what the heck it is, windfall something or other. In 1980, President Reagan signed a Democrat bill, and he was trading it for something else, and I'm sorry he ever did it. I don't know what he was thinking. Didn't affect him, I guess. But if you earned a certain amount of money in other areas, then they would take some of your Social Security away from you. Now, that's money that I paid into it over those years. My employers paid into it, and yet because I had a separate retirement fund in which I had not been paying Social Security, I was penalized 30% of my Social Security. Took it away from me, even though I had earned it. There was no question that I had earned it. It was taken away from me because they decided I was earning too much money. I'm not the only one. This happened to thousands, perhaps millions of people, and yet these so-called refugees coming over here on their hijab are going to get into the system for free and start drawing my money, your money, immediately. Now, here's an interesting little tidbit. I read it to you once before. I'm going to share it with you once more. This was from the November 10th Wall Street Journal. This is from Hamtramck, Michigan, which has elected what is believed to be the first U.S. city with a majority of Muslims, as a recent wave of immigrants put its stamp on the longtime Polish enclave. Arab immigrants, mostly from Yemen, now make up 24% of Hamtramck's population, according to the Census Bureau. Other Muslim immigrants have come from Eastern Europe and Asia. By some estimates, the city's Muslim population has surpassed 50%. Last month, protesters squared off in Dearborn with some carrying guns and posters that read, "Stop the Islamization of America." The city of 96,000 has long attracted Arab Americans. An estimated 40% of Dearborn residents trace their history to the Middle East. Remember what Sheikh Obama said in his book, from Obama's book, Audacity of Hope, quoting, "I will stand with the Muslims should the political winds shift in an ugly direction." That's page 261 of the paperback printing. Obama, addressing the UN, is quoted as saying, "The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam." And that is the alleged President of the United States, who has, if he's not a Muslim, I don't know what he is. Now, there's a movie you need to see. I've shared this a couple of years ago. I recommended this, and if you haven't seen it, you need to see it. It's important to you to have an understanding of what Sharia and Islam is all about. So Sharia and the Qur'an and the Hadith. The Hadith is the law book, if you will. This tome that gives Muslims how to do everything from waking in the morning to going to bed at night, getting married. You read this and it's mind-boggling, the control that that Islam has over its adherents. This movie is called The Stoning of Shariah M. You need to see this. Soraya, S-O-R-I-A-H. The Stoning of Shariah M. You have to see this. It's a must. And basically, it's a story about a woman who is stoned because her husband has the hots for some pretty young woman in the community, and he's Muslim, of course, and he no longer wants his wife, and so he accuses her of adultery. She is not. She has not been committing adultery. This was a movie that is made. It's from a real life incident. Soraya M. was a real victim, and but it gives you a little bit more of the Muslim mindset. And let's see here. Well, we're out of time. It just goes so fast, and there's so much that I need to share with you. I will continue to try. I'm going to continue to try to teach you about Islam. I hope you won't become deterred. I hope you will put it in your heart. You've got to learn this. It's literally for the life and death of our nation. We have got to learn what's happening. In the meantime, God bless you and yours. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, pray for America. Pray for Israel. Pray for your children, because they're inheriting a whirlwind. Till next time, and now remember, we'll broadcast again Sunday at noon. God bless you and yours. Good night.